So tonight we ask, what next? If Nigeria is to move forward as a country, how should it deal with the issue of gender, social and political inclusion? This is clearly one of the major subtexts of Nigeria's 2023 general election. It's an issue that for decades has caused enormous friction in this country, the perception that a substantial part of the populace, such as women, youths and other marginalized groups, are excluded from economic and political opportunities. Well, according to a new report by the Abuja-based think tank Agora Policy, the level of inclusion has hugely incapacitated not just the excluded groups, but the country itself. And this, it says, has had a negative impact on national development. So why are certain groups in this country excluded from economic and political opportunities? And how can those aspiring to lead Nigeria in 2023 remake this country into a more inclusive society? With more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by the founder and executive director of Agora Policy, the think tank that authored that report, Waziri Adio, who just happens to also be an Arise News analyst. And I'm also joined on the line by another co-author of that report, the gender and social inclusion specialist, Dr. Ejiro Igbuzor. Thank you very much to both of you for joining us. And I'll come to you, Dr. Igbuzor, in a minute. But let me start with you, Waziri. Tell us briefly about your report.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. The first thing I want to say is that the issue of inclusion and exclusion has been with us for a long time, even before independence. As you know, there was a lot of discussions leading up to the independence of the country in 1960 about how the minorities will be accommodated. And also, even the major groups, some of them also had their own anxieties about what will happen, whether they will be dominated or they will be marginalized. And that led to the Willing Commission in 1957, and also the incorporation of the Bill of Rights in the Independence Constitution of 1960. So this is not new. The only thing that is new is that we have moved from political inclusion, exclusion, to exclusion along generational lines, along gender lines, which is quite new. So what we have done in this report, which was put together by a group of experts, I will allow Dr. Ejiro Igbuzor to talk more about it. But what we have done is to look at how inclusive is Nigeria as a country, and what explains the low level of inclusion of Nigeria now, and what are the things that should be done about it. But the takeaway is that Nigeria is a country that is low on inclusion, and on the basis of that, Nigeria is not firing on all cylinders. It's not just the groups, the women, the youths, the people living with disabilities, the minorities, the ethnic and religious minorities that are excluded, but the country is also shooting itself in the leg, in the sense that if you have a car that has two or three bad tires, how can that car compete? You know, so you have women who are almost like 50% of the population who are deeply marginalized. You have young people. People below the age of 35 who are about 74.22% of the population, and they are not well empowered, well included. And we also, in this particular election, you find that most of the issues, even the one we speak about and the one we do not speak about, also point towards issue of exclusion and inclusion, whether it's along religious lines, along regional lines. There are issues around, or even around whether the presidency should be zoned not just to a region but to a particular zone of the country. But beyond that, it's not just about religion that we should be talking about. There are also some other markers of identity that are also very important. Religion is important, regionalism is important, but gender is important. The generational dimension too is also very important.
Well, thank you for setting that out for us. And let me come to you, Dr. Ejiro Igbuzor. Thank you very much indeed for your patience. And you've been spoken about as the expert or the expert in this discussion. What's the inclusion score right now in Nigeria, if there is any such thing?
Let me not go the way of numerical score, because one of the problems that we found definitely in this study is also having multiple and inconsistent data from various sources. So if you look at human development indices, for example, you find our local reports saying that the maternal mortality rate for Nigeria is about 540 something per 100,000, whereas the global report is putting it at 900 and something per 100,000. So we're a little bit careful about those numbers. But there's a certain report called the Global Gender Gap Report that is published every year. And it assesses about 140 something countries, sometimes 150 something countries. And that is one of the reliable reports. Between the 2021 and 2022 reports, we found that political empowerment of women has decreased. And that is consistent with our local data that shows how we have moved backwards from where we were in 2015, to moving backwards in 2019. So the figures are not looking good. And with other qualitative indices, like the social institutions and gender index, it also pitches Nigeria at a very low level of inclusion. So we are not doing well, whether we're speaking about our position amongst Africans or even between the national and states. We're not doing well at all. And one clear place where we see that inequality showing up is in our parliaments, right? So in the national parliament, you know that out of 109 seats in Senate, we have only 8 women occupying seats in the Senate. Out of 360 seats in the House of Representatives, we have some 12 women, representing all of the women in Nigeria. And it will shock you to note that in several states of the Federation, I think about 15 states, there is no single woman in parliament. So in a state like, I think I can mention names because this is based on statistics. In a state like Kano, for example, if you have 44 seats, you have 44 men in the state parliament. That's just an example. It's not just a northern thing. That's just the example that comes to mind. It's also, the same way in some of the southern states. And it is appalling. In a country where we say that women and men, are almost 50-50, even though there's a little bit of a difference, some fraction, the level of representation is just appalling. And so our gender inclusion, our inclusion report card is very poor on all fronts. And like, Mr. Adio has rightly said, it's not just the issue of women's representation, it's also the issue of youth representation. It's also the issue of representation of persons with disabilities.
Right.
And it's also the ability of people in certain situations to participate in the development of the country. For example, internally displaced persons, and several others, people living in the hinterlands and all that, people who are somehow vulnerable, for one reason or another.
Right.
They are definitely left behind at this time.
I understand that. Let me come in there, and thank you very much for that detailed explanation. Waziri Adio, how much of a flashpoint is that low score right now in Nigeria?
Well, it is within Nigeria and also outside of Nigeria. When you look at, we can use the political representation as a proxy. to measure the low level of inclusion. But it's not just restricted to political representation. Whether you are talking about financial inclusion, whether you are talking about access to education, access to jobs, access to even in the instance of poverty and all of that. So you find out that some groups are systematically and structurally marginalized, and it's not good for the country. But if you also look at what we, okay, I wanted to talk about if you look at representation on the African continent, representation of women in the parliament, for example, Nigeria has the lowest out of the 54 countries in Africa. And it's not cultural. Sometimes people will say, oh, it's a cultural thing.
Yes,
no.
because I was going to ask you,
because if you look
how
at
much does this map onto something that goes into the cultural and religious spheres in this country, which makes it a much more difficult problem to solve? I mean, Dr. Igbuzor there was talking about Kano and places like that.
So it's not just Kano, because that's a great example, by the way, because Kano has 44 seats and you have only 0 women. You have no women representation at all. But it's not just Kano. You look at a state like Abia, you look at a state like Edo, that are also southern states. So, but the point I was trying to make about not being cultural is that culture is not static, right? There was a time in the whole world where women did not even have the right to vote. The world has moved past beyond that, right? And if you look at Africa, when you look at Rwanda has about 47% women representation in their national parliament. Senegal has 43%. Uganda has 34%. Those are African countries. We have the same culture. They are also patrilineal societies like our own. But the point is that development is a conscious, is a deliberate, is an intentional process. You have to realize that if you leave a significant portion of your population behind, you are shooting yourself in the leg. It's like you have a family that the man says that, because I'm a man, I'm the only one that should be the breadwinner. Yes, if you earn very well, that is fine, but you are moving at only 50% of your strength. So you need to make sure that you empower everybody, the young people. By the way, the part of the young people is that Nigeria has a young population. 74.2% of the Nigerian population is people under 35. And people usually talk about the concept of demographic dividends, which is when you have a greater number of people who are working than the dependents. Nigeria has that opportunity now. But if you have the people, they are not well educated, they are not adequately skilled, they do not have jobs, then what you are going to reap is not demographic dividends, but demographic disaster. And we can see that in the way that is already the young people who are the majority, who are alienated, who are excluded, who are left behind. We see the way they are getting already restless. We see that in the NSAS, we see that in all the things that is going on now. So if you want to develop as a country, you have to identify the things that are dragging you behind, and you also have to make sure that you give everybody a stake in the development of the country, and you give everybody the resources, the economic, the social, the political resources that they need to make the best of their own lives, but also to be able to make the meaningful contribution that they should to the country.
That's a very important point. And let me bring you in, Dr. Ejiro Igbuzor. Thank you again for your patience. As Waziri Adio was saying there, the lack of having a government, for example, that has representations, because I know you talked about women, but you also talked about the youth, and you talked about that's part of the report, the other groups that feel marginalized. The lack of having a government, for example, that has representations from different regions, ethnicities, religions, and genders is what makes people feel unrepresented, is it not? And that's what often leads to marginalization, divisions, and sometimes even conflict.
Absolutely. You are very right. And like Mr. Waziri started to say at the beginning, these feelings of exclusion have been with us, even in the colonial times, where some ethnic minorities felt that, they were being cheated, by the majority groups. And Nigeria has made several efforts at, of course, several junctures to put in place mechanisms, to ensure that national integration is actually fostered. So one of those things that Nigeria has done is to put in place a federal character principle enshrined in the Constitution. In the course of this study, we actually engaged with various opinion leaders, and there is a consensus that even with the federal character principle enshrined in our Constitution, if it were implemented as stated, perhaps the feelings of exclusion would have been less. But there are opinions, around the fact that people who have had opportunities to implement the federal character principle have done so arbitrarily without any regard to the rule of law, and all of that. So that is part of why some ethnic groups still feel excluded today. Also in literature, we found that, the narratives around exclusion has also been exploited, because at the end of the day, what the study threw up was that there are two key things, that are responsible for all of the agitations. The fact that people want to take hold of power, or they feel that they have been marginalized, and they do not have enough access to power, and then access to resources. And there's consensus from many people that we spoke with that if Nigeria was administered in a way that people did not need to be in government to survive, people did not need to be in government to make a living. So government provides enabling environment, and there are enough resources to go around and to enable people to actualize their potentials, then the agitations would have been less. So this is part of what is coming out from the study, the fact that people feel excluded, because they lack access to power, they lack access to resources, they are unable to fulfill their potentials because of the way the country is being run arbitrarily. So there's weak implementation of the Federal Character Act, and that is one of the things that came out with regards to ethnic and religious minorities. When it comes to women, there are several issues, all right? So there are the issues of patriarchy, a society that believes that men are superior to women. Our society actually believes that the domestic space is the legitimate space for women, even though many women have broken through that space and now occupy the public space. But there's also those cultural leanings and religious leanings as well about women not being suitable for the public space, and this is part of the reason why we're where we are. So we have sociocultural and religious norms hindering women from attaining positions of representation and participating in the development of the country.
Well,
we also have political corruption, which is
I don't mean to interrupt you there, but we've got like about 5 minutes or so left. And I want to ask you this, Dr. Igbuzor, and I mean, you've made some very good, very stridently set out what the issues are. What are the recommendations of your report? How do you deepen gender, social, and political inclusion in Nigeria?
Well, one of the key things that we interrogated was, the structure of the country. How do we govern Nigeria? What is the best way to govern Nigeria to ensure that there is inclusion? And there is still consensus that federalism is the best way, just like many plural states. Federalism is still the best way. But one thing that came out clearly is that stakeholders believe that there is too much concentration of powers at the center. And so the paper recommends constitutional amendment to devolve more powers to the sub-national units, but not without empowering them, because again, the capacity of states and local government become serious issues. What capacity do they have to deliver? And how do we plan to empower them so that even when more power is devolved to those units, they are able to deliver on their mandates much more than they have done? And then, of course, we also recommend an oversight system that holds public officers accountable. And of course, in addition, apart from the National Assembly, having effective oversight, we're also recommending a system where civil society, community members, religious groups within communities become interested in governance to the point that they hold their representatives accountable. There are several follow the money schemes, that are out there in the polity, and we need to strengthen them, and we need to do that in collaboration with government to ensure that our government becomes more accountable. One other thing that came out with regards to ethnic exclusion and how we can foster the spirit of inclusion is rotational presidency. Of course, parties have tried their hands on zoning. We've not really built a consensus and a good structure to master how we zone, various positions to the various regions. Well, the paper recommends rotational presidency, and the idea of rotational presidency as an antidote to feelings of exclusion, and what we're proposing is something similar to the Swiss model of collective presidency.
Right.
But because Nigeria is a multi-ethnic state, it is difficult for us to say rotate presidency from one ethnic group to another. And so we're proposing that rotational presidency might require us to rotate the position to the geopolitical zones.
Right. Well, that point has
whatever
been...
we have recommended here, they are just proposals for us to explore.
Right,
the fact
okay.
is that
that point has actually it's been made in the past, and I'm glad that your report re-emphasizes that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, and I apologize, but we've got about a minute and a half or so left, and I want this question to go to Waziri Adio. In the past, Waziri attempts, as Dr. Igbuzor was saying there, attempts to find a way through have not necessarily been successful. So this time around, do you think Nigerians can find the strength to start the process of proper inclusion? Does 2023 offer that opportunity?
Well, I don't think it should be a question of whether we can find the strength. We should, because this is existential. It's a very practical thing. If we continue with business as usual, we continue to pull below our weight. So definitely it's now our collective enlightened self-interest to make sure that we put all the resources that we have. And just to build on some of the recommendations.
Very briefly, because we're literally
part of the recommendations
seconds.
in the reports also that reserved seats should be given to like an affirmative action to women, to youth, to people living with disability, and to also to minorities. And also, we also recommended, the report also recommended that this tension between citizenship and indigenship should be resolved in favor of citizenship. Nigerians anywhere, people go across the world, and within 2 or 3 years or a few years, they become citizens of those countries. And you are a citizen of Nigeria. There are places where you can't run for office. There are places where you can't even get a job.
That's a very
so
important
we can't move forward as a country if we still have all those self-imposed constraints on us.
That's an exceedingly important point. And on that note, I want to thank you very much indeed, Waziri Adio, who is the founder and executive director of Agora Policy. That's the think tank that came up with that report. And of course, Dr. Ejiro Igbuzor, who co-authored that report and is a gender and social inclusion specialist. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of Arise Primetime. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye and thank you for watching.